prepared a presentation, but this is not going to be a lecture-style conversation. Instead, we very much want to have a dialogue with you. So we're going to be introducing some concepts about research ethics, and then asking you some queries about your own research practices and maybe some ethical issues you deal with in your own research. And then we will be giving you some examples and case studies of some ethical quandaries with which we are engaged. So I'm going to hand it over to Elissa to begin the presentation.
All right, thank you, Leslie, and thanks everyone for being here again. And if at any point anyone has any questions or thoughts, please let us know. The thing about ethics is that it's very dynamic and it's very contextual, and we have experience from the types of work that we've done in archaeology and heritage, but as you'll kind of see as we talk through some of the issues, it can vary greatly depending on what kind of research you're doing, what kind of samples you're working with, and what kind of communities your research may impact. So we'd love to hear from people who've worked in different contexts, since every example we have can really help inform our understandings and help us all be better scientists and researchers and community members. So we just kind of, let's see if I can get that going. So just as a kind of starting point in discussion, broadly, again, we're going to be talking about research ethics, but even what we mean when we say research ethics is something we need to think about. So just as a kind of general question, when you hear the term ethics, what does that mean to you all when you hear ethics? What do you think of when somebody says, ethics, or we need to, comply with ethics, or this kind of a thing? Does anyone have any experience or thoughts on what that means to them? Yeah.
Norms and values for me,
So norms and values, yeah, absolutely. And these can be also, if you have any examples of like specific ethics that come to mind that are important in research, yeah.
It's not harmful.
Not harmful, yeah.
Beneficence and reciprocity.
Reciprocity, yeah.
Codes of conduct.
Codes of conduct.
Let's say future proofing. Think about people in the future.
People in the future, yeah. So it's not necessarily just about what's happening right now, but it's also about what's going on in the future, and especially in our work, potentially what's happened in the past as well.
Confidentiality, anonymity.
Anonymity, yeah. And then there's some specific things sometimes that can be pretty common in research. So anonymity is definitely something that comes up a lot in research ethics, especially if you're dealing with modern populations and subjects.
It's also about when you're working with the human events like the wars, you have to take in account that these people that have been living before, you have to take care what the work with the human events and treat it accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really big one that there's been a lot of conversation about recently, and especially with specific populations, there may be even more specific concerns about things like photographs or destructive sampling. And I have some examples, we can come back to that and expand on that, because I think archaeologists encounter those issues a lot across the board. Okay, yeah, I think that's good. So just a couple of definitions that pop up when you just kind of look up ethics. So rules for distinguishing between right and wrong, professional codes of conduct, so people have mentioned that. Sometimes ethics can be applied almost as like a religious creed, so also kind of social and religious norms in a more general sense, not in a research sense, but just when we're thinking about the term ethics. But broadly, when we talk about ethics, it's norms for conduct, that distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And of course, this can be difficult because those differences between unacceptable and acceptable can be very contextual, depending on who you're working with and what you're working with. So why do we care about ethics in research? And there's a couple of things on here, but I'd also like to hear from you all why you think ethics is important, and if anyone has specific examples of times where you've run into kind of ethics issues or why you personally feel it's important. It'd be really interesting to hear from people if anyone has any thoughts on why do we care about it? Why do we even, why don't we just do our research to the best we can and just care about, the methods and getting things published? Why do we have to think about, what is acceptable or unacceptable?
Maybe copyright is a good example of
Copyright.
ethics.
Yep.
Because when you are copying some other works, another person worked on it very hard, and then you are just plagiarizing it, and this should not be done.
Yeah.
And it's one of the code of ethics again.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard to, if you don't have those copyright laws and things related to plagiarism, it becomes very difficult to do research because then you can't, ascribe exactly who's doing the work, and you have less, motivation to do that work if somebody's just going to steal it.
Yeah.
Consequence. Yeah, absolutely.
Anyone else?
In my case, when we do any research, for example, in humanities or in education, we have a consent form. Like before taking any picture, we don't want to create any harm for the students, basically. So I think we should think not about only about ourselves, but about the work. Will it create any problem for those people who are taking some action in research or not? So I think this is very important, not only think about yourself, but about the surrounding as well.
That's a great point, that it's not just necessarily about your own personal ethics or even the ethics of a field, but consent, I think, is a really good point, where ethics are shared and expanded outward from one group or one person, right, as almost a protective measure.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, when we're thinking about the kinds of research we're doing, making sure that everyone understands what's happening and what will be involved. And from a purely, potentially, I guess, selfish standpoint, people aren't going to want to work with researchers as well if you're not being honest with them, if you're not being upfront and clear about what your goals are, what you're going to be doing with photographs or data. So it's both good practice from the standpoint of using yourself as a researcher doing your work, and then also just from a moral perspective of working with communities.
Evaluation of values while doing research. So we usually have Western guidelines, IRBs, right, institution review boards. So as I've been working for the project called CARE, it's Central Asian Research Ethics, now we are collaboratively creating national code for each Central Asian country. And now I'm in the stage of collecting data, so from 3 Central Asian countries. And what we got to know that only international and Western universities have that IRBs. Now we are trying to develop contextually relevant national policies. So I'd like to know your opinions. How can we develop contextually relevant national and institutional policies to support ethical research in Central Asian context? Because whatever is existing in the West, they might not be applicable in our context, because we have different religious, national values that might not be in priority in the West, or vice versa.
Yeah, and that's really difficult, because I'll also say that even inside the West, there can be really tricky things dealing with IRBs, and a lot of times I have a lot of colleagues. I deal mostly with human remains, so because I'm not dealing with live human subjects, I don't deal with IRB boards that much. But a lot of my friends who do talk about how a lot of them were designed for things like medical research, and even in the West we have a lot of different cultures, and these boards are often aimed at very specific guidelines, very specific types of research. So I think that it's great that you're doing that, because I think that honestly we could use a lot of looking at our own boards and reevaluating and how we think about these relationships kind of with communities. And I think a lot of times IRB boards think about specifically protecting individuals as opposed to kind of communities as well. So I think one thing to keep in mind is not just how do we protect things like individual privacy, but how do we respect community values and community religious beliefs. How you do that in terms of like a logistical kind of setup is difficult other than
There is a misunderstanding, you know?
Yeah.
Misunderstanding of ethics. Many people think that's anti-plagiarism, and it's about beneficence, and the term is like differently interpreted. It's about more moral values and like personal responsibilities.
right. Yeah, absolutely. But I think that, when you can get together boards that have, as diverse voices within the community as possible and kind of hearing and trying to keep them on track of like, this isn't about morality, this is just making sure that we're respecting people, we're making sure that people are able to, have knowledge and consent of the research that's happening. I think one thing that's really important in the process is that communication with your subjects and making sure that they truly understand, because it can be hard communicating, especially really technical types of research or even certain social studies that can be highly theoretical. And so making sure that whoever you're talking to really understands the consequences, the kind of long-term consequences, is something that's really important to kind of go into those codes. And again, making sure that it's not just a group of 3 or 4 people who are creating these codes, but people who have different experiences and backgrounds. And I think different experiences with different types of research, because again, somebody
Our
doing...
focus is on social science.
Okay, so that's a little bit better than the IRBs that are trying to do medical and anthropology and everything else in between. So that's really interesting. So, and please, since you're doing that work,
It's from all countries, so all universities from each countries are doing collaboratively. So it's financed by Nazarbayev University.
Okay, wonderful. That's great.
What is the time frame for this
Now
project?
it's the second year. Now we have like 1 more year. So by the end of the next year, we have to finish and like provide it. Now we finished the quant part. Now we are working on the data collection. So we are supposed to have more than 100 interviews of Elissa.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a great data
that's
set.
a great work. So like more than 25 team members. It's not 3, 4. All the people out there.
Well, I don't think you need our opinion or advice. I think you're doing just fine.
It was very interesting for me to hear your point of view as well.
It'll be interesting to see how they compare. As we can certainly refine codes of ethics that exist. And especially people that are engaging in this research today, I think have a lot to contribute, because sometimes our codes of ethics are outdated. We did it long ago, or we haven't refreshed it, or we haven't taken into account contemporary changes and things like that. So because yours is very new, I think it'll be very interesting for not just your own collaborators, but for other people, because it's going to be very modern and very new, and I'm sure we'll all learn something from that. So, brilliant.
And I have a question for you actually. So as someone who's going to be probably looking at your recommendations, because I started working with geneticists with DNA samples from animal bones in my case, I know that animal bones aren't often considered a social science resource, but within the ancient genetics world, there is actually a big ethical debate about how we manage those investigations. What do we take out of country? How do we give credit to maybe sample providers? Do we give them authorships? Do we give them acknowledgements? How do we deal with that? It's a very new field, so there doesn't seem to be a very clear way forward that's globally agreed upon. So if you guys happen to touch on that at all, I think we'd be really interested to talk to you, because a lot of geneticists are biologists. Oh, once again, I have audio problems. A lot of my colleagues are biologists, and they don't come from a social science background, so they're not familiar with anthropology or ethics. They simply come in with their hypothesis and they want to test it. They don't really think about the implications of what it is they're doing. They don't think about the interpretations, they don't think about the communities, they don't think about the samples as a resource. And they often rely on their collaborators in countries such as Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to tell them. But then I think people, maybe some of our collaborators also don't understand the value of what they're giving away.
Yeah, you mean the notions of insiders and outsiders. So that's happened in our research as well, because there were like keys already published papers on Uzbekistan written by those like collaborators abroad. And it had really contradicting ideas. So without being on the research side, there was a publication because the materials were available only in hard copies and in Uzbek language. So it means that it's a really issue. So I was just contradicting, like I was arguing them. So why you are saying that it doesn't exist? It exists, but it's in Uzbek language.
Yes, just
So
because it's not in
the-
English doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yes, so that was my point actually. And then I was included in the project as an Uzbek speaking person, and as an like insider, I was supposed to like translate whatever exists in Uzbek language. So from other people who come to the Central Asia and learn the field, they might lack those opportunities as a like outsider. They may not have an access to those resources, but just like writing a paper and publishing and letting the world know about it's also a term of research ethics.
Absolutely.
It's like insiderness and outsiderness challenges.
Very much so. Very much so. And I think you're touching on notes of accessibility as well,
Yeah.
which are deeply intertwined with ethics, right? Because who has access to these statements of ethics, both in terms of shaping them and in terms of even accessing content, right?
Yes, because it's like granting access is giving power. It's saying, I want to work with you. So in the ancient genetics community, there's two bones that are great for genetics, and they're both in your ears, one in each ear. If both of those bones are gone from a human skull, the ability to do genetics really decreases. If those two are gone, that's it. That's that potential loss forever. And that information is gone. So whoever curates that material has to be really careful about who they give access to. You know,
I was astonished on the fact that how the paper was like published without like having the proof, like, just based on the existing online information in English language, without catching up on the real fact that is only available only in the local language. That's also an issue of research ethics. I said we're doing research ethics in Central Asia, and you are destroying your like ethics. And I was just arguing with the competitors. And it was interesting to know that there are some cases where being outsider might cause some inappropriate attitude towards research and how can rely on the research. Yeah, that was my point actually.
Excellent.
Absolutely. And I think that we can kind of have some slides, but we can kind of jump around depending on what we're talking about. So we kind of had, where to go? So when we're thinking about ethics and crafting ethical research, we've kind of touched on these three different, I don't know why it says 111, it's supposed to say 1, 2, 3, but kind of, there's in some ways 3 ways that we can group what these concerns are when we're trying to think about and create ethical research. So we have, working with the communities who are going to be impacted with your research, whether or not that's the people you're studying or the people who are physically proximate to the places you're doing your study, or the people, who will be impacted by the results of your research. And then, we're just doing a lot of talking about collaborators and other researchers in the field. So that's another group that, you have to think about kind of the ethics of that, whether or not it's the accessibility of the data and citing the correct people, including people who are actually contributing to the research in things like publication and acknowledgements. And then we also have ethical obligations to the materials as well, right? So we brought up already the idea of human remains as kind of a special material that has certain ethical obligations, but that goes towards a lot of different materials that may be still important to a descendant community, or as Ashley was pointing out, materials that, once, if we're doing destructive analysis, future researchers might not have an opportunity to engage with, so we really have that obligation to even physical things we're working with as well. I think that,
No, I think that's good. I should have mentioned at the beginning our specialties, actually. So we're approaching these questions from very different perspectives. I'm an art historian, an archaeologist, and a museum curator. So I'm obviously deeply interested in questions of provenance, in questions of working with living communities, and in questions of interpretation and display.
And I'm a bioarchaeologist, so I work a lot with human osteological remains, but also thinking about, again, how a lot of burial practices and kind of working with the dead can still be interpreted by living communities in really different contexts and different ways. I also work in North America where there's very different understandings of the handling of the dead than there are in other contexts. And so that's a lot of my background is thinking about human remains as a very specific type of research material, and also about that potential community engagement and how we can work with communities to make sure that the research is being done in that ethical way, but in a different way than Leslee. So in terms of working with communities, again, feel free to interrupt us if you have any questions. I'm just going to kind of start going through some of the ideas. And again, as archaeologists, I think that there is more and more of an understanding and thinking about the people who kind of occupy the areas around where we do our work and who are connected to the people we're studying. But I think it can still be easy to kind of feel isolated and to kind of literally be buried in the past and not think about how our work really impacts and engages with living communities. And so this goes for archaeology as well as other disciplines. So when you're working with communities, science research doesn't happen in a vacuum. You're always going to be impacting people with what you produce. And so when you're thinking about that interaction with the community, you can think about it physically. You know, sometimes what we're doing will actually alter the landscape. You know, as archaeologists, we're digging holes. We might be disturbing agricultural activities. You know, we might be impacting the community in other ways. We might be either in a positive or in a negative way. So financially is another way that our research might impact communities, again, either negatively or positively. So if we're employing people from the community, that might be one way that is really bringing money into the community, but you have to think about what that relationship is like, and that if you are paying people that it's fair wages, and that we're really having that financial responsibility when you're bringing in, especially when there's kind of disproportionate wealth, if it's a Western team with a lot of money coming into an impoverished community, there's a lot of political, social, economic dynamics that can really cause, I won't say trouble, but issues that you might not have anticipated with local communities and groups. And so you really have to think this through when you're bringing that kind of financial resource into a community.
I just want to add something just in terms of like, not even external communities, but within the same community, how financial aspects really can call into question professional ethics. In a museum, for instance, say you want to work with a local artist from your community, that can often have a really unequal power arrangement, right? Often an artist will be eager to have his or her work shown in the museum, right? And will be willing to make compromises that they might not actually want to make, right? And so I think it's very important that we're always advocating not on behalf of our institutions, but on behalf of the collaborators who are working with us, because otherwise those relationships are just not equal. You know? So I think financial ethics is something that we don't talk about a lot. It's something that I think in a lot of cultures, money is seen as something kind of vulgar to discuss. But actually, it's incredibly important to talk about financial ethics for all of these reasons, right? In terms of societal impact as well as individual impact. I think it's very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if anybody has any experience or thoughts on these, yeah.
I just want to add that I think it gets complicated when we also think about communities not being homogeneous, but having power relations within local communities, for example, and then having to, it makes us sometimes take difficult decisions, like on whose side are we, or whom do we kind of empower or not, or so.
Yeah, absolutely. And who has, the power to speak for a community? Is there anyone who has, and sometimes people step up and they might present themselves as the person person who is making the decisions for the community, but if you're not, familiar with the community, that might not actually be the case. So you really need to invest time too. It's, that's part of it too. It's just the time investment of working with the community, not just showing up and kind of saying this is, how things are doing, but again, thinking about all of those dynamics. And yeah, a lot of times that means that there are going to be people with different agendas and different interests within the community. Absolutely.
And sometimes there isn't a right answer,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes there's just an answer you arrive at by consensus, and you do your best to listen to everyone and hear everybody's perspective. But I think that's a very important point. The communities are not homogenous, they're heterogeneous, and I, for example, I'm a specialist of Islamic art, right? And to whom do I listen if there is a disagreement about interpretation? Who speaks on behalf of all Muslims, right? So often I will learn from different community members who have very different opinions, and I think all I can do in that situation is give time to everybody, listen to everybody equally, and try and take a decision which is respectful, but doesn't give authority to any one community, because it's also not in my power to give that authority to any one community, right? So these are very tricky, and I think that you can see easily that Elissa and I are going to be giving you lots of questions, not many answers.
But I think it is those questions, as soon as you start asking and engaging with the questions, that's how you start down the road of ethics. And again, there's not one template that will work for everything. And yeah, just kind of continuing on talking about the communities, and you guys touched on it a little bit, we have to think ideologically how our research articulates. Is there going to be some conflict with, religious or cultural beliefs that really makes it something that is inappropriate for the community? And I think this is something we have to be careful with, because if you show up and present a plan for research without thinking about whether or not it's appropriate ahead of time, a community may feel pressured to engage with you even if there are some conflicts. So especially if there is a financial or otherwise power imbalance. So you can't just assume that, nobody said anything, so what I'm doing is fine. You have to put in more work to actually understand the impacts of your work. It's, again, especially, speaking from a Western perspective, but again, even if there's financial or other power imbalances, you can't assume that people feel that they are able to come to you with their problems. So it's really incumbent as a researcher to figure that out and do that work yourself. You can't put that on the community. So another thing we can think about when we're working ethically with communities is how also not only that our research isn't doing harm to the community, but how can we actually enrich communities? How can we actually give back to communities through our research? We get things like publications and jobs and fundings based on the work that we do with communities, either directly or indirectly. And so I think another thing that is becoming more at the forefront, but is still kind of not nearly as engaged with enough, is again giving back to communities and taking what we can and engaging with them both on our research and in other ways as well. So, we've already talked a little bit in terms of the financial aspect and making sure that financially we are being fair with everyone and kind of enriching the community literally as much as we can without inadvertently creating, power imbalances, and that's something that's very different community to community and can get quite tricky. But also things like sharing your research with the community. A lot of times I think we think, what we're doing is so complicated or it won't be interesting to people, and I found this, I think, especially with heritage, especially with studies that are, socially oriented, people do want to know what we're doing. They want to, especially if they're the subjects. But even with, archaeology, so these are a couple of pictures from my friend Stephen Goldstein, and his work group in Kenya, Africa, and they've done a fantastic job working with communities, and they work often on very, very old sites, going back, tens, hundreds of thousands of years, and these are sites that a lot of times people would assume, the communities don't have any connection, they're so old. But a lot of these communities still feel a lot of kinship, a lot of connection to even these really old materials and osteological remains. So that's direct ancestral connection. A lot of times they are just interested in the history of the land and the area that they're occupying. So Steve and his team, they had workshops, they brought school groups to the sites and showed them. So there are a lot of things that, you know, don't necessarily take a lot of money, but are really meaningful and you know, also help people from the community think about how they could engage with the research, how they could contribute as well. And sometimes, you know, there are cases where you might put up a permanent exhibit as well, so that, you know, you kind of have that longer term contribution to research in the community, whether or not sometimes they're small museums, sometimes it's something more ephemeral like a workshop or a talk. And I think, again, that engagement can also lead you to asking a really important question, which is what kind of research the community wants as well. You know, we're equipped with expertise, with potentially money and resources. So the other thing we can do for communities is ask them what questions they're interested about. What do they want to know about their past? What would they like to see built or brought to their communities?
Absolutely, and sometimes this is not completely possible. You know, sometimes it's just not feasible. In terms of what people are asking for is not necessarily possible. But I think just the respect of asking and listening to what people need, and as Elissa mentioned earlier, and just being very honest with communities about what you can deliver. I think one of the worst things you can do with communities is listen to them, promise something, and then not do it. You know. So I think just having that very honest conversation is so very clear. And the other thing is, I think sparking curiosity is something that should not be underestimated, right? Many of us, I'm sure, in this room, do what we do because maybe as children we had an experience, or someone told us a story, or we saw something somewhere. It doesn't take much to really inspire, you know, a child to search for something in a profession, right? So I think, you know, if we can inculcate, I suppose, curiosity in the communities with which we're working and give people or expand on existing opportunities for people, I think that is a very important contribution that we can make to the communities with whom we work. Right? It doesn't always have to be financial or tangible, right? It can be being a thought partner.
Does anyone have any experiences working with communities that they found particularly interesting or difficult they'd like to talk about?
Communities in what sense?
Well, just if anyone has done kind of like community outreach or bringing, you know, local people to sites or doing that kind of talks or anything that they found particularly, yeah.
It's not from my experience. It's like interesting also when we think about the terminology, like things used to be like local or like people in the region, or like why did you choose to say community? Like what does that mean to you? Because also I think maybe if you like did your degree in Europe, that means like it has to be somewhere else. But not necessarily. It's equally as important, like whether you're Central Asian working in Central Asia or European working in Europe, it can also be that like, oh, like I'm literally digging like in my hometown, but you should still have that kind of, you should still have to like share with like everyone who lives there. Like I think we have to really like, yeah.
That's a good point. And I'll tell you, as somebody who's worked with a lot of governmental and intergovernmental agencies like, you know, UNESCO and that kind of thing, usually the term is stakeholder. Right? And I hate that term. It sounds so clinical, you know? But yeah, I think, you know, we kind of, it's now kind of not so trendy, right? Now it's more to use the word community, because I do think it, I mean, stakeholder is accurate, right?
Yeah,
it is an accurate term.
And it's very like official and important.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's one of the reasons that it's not used so much anymore, that we do try to have more inclusive language, you know, like the word community. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And even the financial connotation.
And it has a financial connotation too, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point too.
Yeah. And then also doing the extra step, like kind of if it's, you know, public outreach is one thing, that's great, but then it has to be like sustainable.
For
right?
sure, for
That
sure.
it's not just being like, hey kids, it's great to do archaeology, and then like,
And then you abandon them, exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, I know a cool project in Alaska where they like it's like an Yupik village. Like they do like the archaeological like excavations, and some of them are like becoming archaeologists of their own. With like very much. It's not just like, oh yeah, we should give back, but it's really kind of like this.
Yeah, there's some really fantastic projects in building a long-term project where people are actually able to become archaeologists and to work with their own communities, do their own kind of histories of their people. And I'm not sure, I don't have experience in Europe or other places, but it would be really interesting to see more of that happening around the world.
We have about 10 minutes left, so.
We did start late. I don't know if we're able to.
Yeah, that's even going with the late start. Yeah. So I think maybe we can ask Elissa to talk about one of the case studies from her work, because I think it's quite fascinating. So let's ask Elissa, maybe, if she wants to give a case study.
Before we do that, can we talk about MOUs?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. There's just a couple of things I wanted to talk about before I talk about case studies, if we still have time, because I think it's important. So kind of going back to thinking about not just working with communities, but working with fellow researchers and collaborators, there's obviously all kinds of different things we need to think about when we're working with our colleagues and designing projects with them, but certain things that often do come up are issues with authorship. So when we're creating research projects, getting ready to publish, who gets recognized? What kind of contributions are considered important enough to be considered on the paper? And this is something that sometimes journals or institutions will actually have specific guidelines for, which is interesting, and sometimes they can be fairly restrictive in terms of specific writing contributions. There's definitely been a push more for including people like laboratory technicians, people who are doing a lot of the physical and active work, and people who are working on site, who are doing the actual excavation. I think a lot of the current guidelines for authorship kind of still prioritize the people who are able to take the samples back, to do the research, to do the writing, which is a very particular echelon of the academic and research community. So again, there are kind of guidelines out there that you can look at, but I would say that they kind of have to be taken with a grain of salt, and it's really I think important though to talk to the team ahead of time and think about what your priorities are for having people as authors and making sure that people who are making major contributions are going to be included. And it's something good to talk about before you get to the publication process, because at that point it can become quite contentious. Copyrights and patents, again, so intellectual property, keeping plagiarism in check is obviously very important for making sure that people's work is not stolen, and thinking about also data sharing. So what do we do once we've collected all these data? Is it something we want to make open access? There's a big push to make right now in academia to make as much as possible kind of open and accessible to the broader public. What's interesting though is I think a lot of people have treated open access as kind of blanket a good thing. I work with a lot of communities in North America who don't see open access as a good thing necessarily, because it still feels to them like researchers coming in, taking data from their people and then giving it to the world, and they feel like that's not appropriate. They might have made agreements with specific individuals to study them, but that's not the same as saying the entire world can have that information. So even something like open access, while it might sound like, oh, this is such a good thing for everyone, even that is something that ethically we need to sometimes take a step back and really think about who these things are impacting in the long term. These are just a couple of, so this is from Elsevier, this is one kind of guideline on authorship, this is one from Harvard. Yeah, I was gonna say, I think we're gonna share these slides, so you'll be able to.
You'll get a copy of the presentations.
Yeah, but I'm not gonna go through all of these now, because they're a little tedious and again, problematic in some ways, but it's good to kind of know what's out there. And the one other thing I kind of wanted to bring up in terms of working with research collaborators is the possibility of crafting a memorandum of agreement or understanding. So these are often called MOUs, and these are actual kind of formal written agreements between partners, kind of establishing the ground rules for conducting research and what's going to be done with data that is produced from research. So it will do things like outline roles of different individuals, kind of who's going to be conducting what research. It often kind of helps prevent misunderstandings because everyone can say, nope, I said that this is what my role was, and you said that you were going to complete this, and you haven't, and so, maybe your role is, you don't have that role anymore, we're going to bring somebody else in. It kind of helps to keep everyone accountable. And it can also do things like establish authorship, timelines for publication, and returning specimens. So oftentimes if you're exporting samples abroad from an institution, it will often say, you can do this, but you have to bring the samples back by X date, and you have to publish something like that by whatever date. And that ensures that things don't disappear. It ensures that the work that you say you're going to do gets done. And now I know a lot of you here, this is an early career conference. It can be intimidating to ask more senior individuals on a project for something like this. So I don't want to make it seem like this is a universal thing. It unfortunately is not. But I think that if you bring it up and present it as something where you're like, I just want to be very clear on what my role is, on what our timelines are, it doesn't have to be contentious. Some people will still treat it as so I don't want to make it sound like an easy thing to do. But these are important, and a lot of universities have kind of templates for them online, so there's a lot of wording that is already available to you, so you don't have to kind of start from scratch. This is just kind of a blank template one, so you can find these online anywhere. So if you're interested in doing something like this would also be a great opportunity for you guys to work with the stepsisters. We all, a lot of us have experience writing these, and we're happy to help you guys craft language to, help you figure out how to establish these with your group. So I would encourage you, as much as possible, to have these MOUs for things like field work, long-term projects, because they can be really helpful and clarifying and avoid a lot of misunderstanding. So do you guys must use some MOUs in that?
Oh, tons.
Yeah.
We use MOUs all the time. For community work, for working with artists, for working with even contractors, we use it all the time. So MOUs are becoming much, much more common. And really, it's just about clear communication, right? It's about communicating expectations and deliverables very clearly so that there's no confusion. And as Elissa said, it's sometimes some people don't want to do them, especially like older, more established scholars are often a little bit resistant to them, but it's becoming more and more common. And certainly the generation of people sitting in this room are going to be part of the generation that makes this completely normal.
Has anyone written or been on a project with an MOU? They know. Okay, so some people, but not, not as many as I would like, but some. Okay, that's good to know that at least it's around a bit. Okay.
Does anyone have any comments, feedback, or questions for us?
I would say it's almost the norm now in say universities, and I think any project where you have a partnership with any other organization or community or anything, and that will do a research agreement across the board. So I think
That's good.
Yeah, there are definitely certain places in which it's much more common, and I think that's going to become more common. That's a really good point. Yeah, in some places, as Kristen just pointed out, if you didn't hear her, in the UK universities, she was saying it's already the norm to have MOUs. I think that we are probably at the end of our time here. Sorry that we didn't get to go through all of the material that Elissa had prepared, but as she said,
That's okay. If anyone is interested in dealing with specifically human osteological remains or otherwise, we'll have more coffee breaks and stuff, and I'm happy to kind of talk about my experiences with that. So yeah, there'll be more opportunities.
and you will have a copy of the presentation as well.
Yes.
And we're always available for any questions that you have. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you all.